Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Austin Petersen here, former presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party. Welcome to the Libertarian Republic's live stream, The Freedom Report, hosted live every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday on YouTube at youtube.com/AuggieP. Augie P is my nickname. YouTube.com is where you'll find us live. If you're watching us later on Facebook, thanks so much. But you do miss us by about 1 hour. I usually stream these later on Facebook. So if you were hoping to catch me when you could actually chat with all the little Freedom Ninjas, then you've got to catch us at youtube.com/AuggieP. But if you're watching us now, of course, welcome, glory, glory, hallelujah, and welcome to the show. Tonight's topic is one of the most interesting topics and one of the most hotly debated in libertarian circles. And I actually understand that my opinion on this topic is going to put me in a minority in the libertarian movement. But of course, whenever one finds oneself on the side of the majority, as Mark Twain said, it is time for reform. And that's the natural contrarian position. Of course, most libertarians take the contrarian position, I think, sometimes when it comes to their views of the Civil War, on Abraham Lincoln, on John Brown, on the question of secession. Is secession racist? We'll be discussing all these topics and more on tonight's show. But before we get to the topics of John Brown, war, slavery, blood, flintlocks, fire, blood, and death, we're going to hear from a libertarian icon, Dr. Ron Paul himself, on the subject of the Civil War, and then we will discuss all of these topics and more, so I hope you all enjoy this piece.
I was intrigued by your comments about Abe Lincoln. According to Paul, Abe Lincoln should never have gone to war. There were better ways of getting rid of slavery.
Absolutely. 600,000 Americans died in a senseless civil war. No, he shouldn't have gone to war. He did this just to enhance and get rid of the original intent of the Republic. I mean, it was to iron fist in Washington.
We'd still have slavery.
Oh, come on, Tim. Slavery was phased out in every other country of the world, and the way I'm advising that it should have been done is do like the British Empire did. You buy the slaves and release them. How much would that cost compared to killing 600,000 Americans and where it lingered for 100 years? I mean, the hatred and all that existed. So every other major country in the world got rid of slavery without a civil war. I mean, that doesn't sound too radical to me. That sounds like a pretty reasonable approach.
You're running as a...
Now, of course, I have been a big fan of Dr. Ron Paul for years, and I know many of the people who are watching right now are absolutely big fans of Ron Paul. He's the reason why I am in the liberty movement today. He's the reason why I'm an activist. I never would have run for president of the United States if I had not been inspired by Dr. Ron Paul. However, over the years, as I got myself more embedded in the liberty movement, I'm going to give you guys the background on my thinking and my history on this, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about the facts. But these are my anecdotes. And as I got more into the libertarian movement, of course, I became enamored by Paul, speakers like Tom Woods, people like Judge Andrew Napolitano, and I began to read some of the libertarian revisionist history, specifically about the Civil War. When I was a little boy, my father and my grandfather would take me to Washington, D.C., and we would frequently go on trips to the battlefields on the Civil War. And so I was steeped in the history of the American Civil War and of secession, the question of secession, from a very young age. And we would walk the battlefields, we would go up to Little Round Top, and I would pretend, when I was a little boy, I would pretend that I was a member of the Union, of course, because that was the side that won, that was the side of the United States, and so I considered myself a bit of a Billy Yank, and that's what I pretended I was when I would walk around the battlefields, and of course we would go see Stonewall Jackson's arm, and I was enamored by the history of it. And as I got a little bit older and I developed a bit more of a rebellious streak, and as I dabbled in libertarianism, I found quite a bit of revisionist history about the Civil War that made some arguments that I had not been taught in my high school and my college history classes. And that some of this was defending the behavior, the secession of the South. And so I became even more engrossed in the arguments about secession, the question of whether or not it was legitimate or not. Was it constitutional or not? Was it moral or not? Was it really just a tool that was used by modern-day segregationists or the modern-day Klan or the modern-day white supremacy movement as a way to advance their agenda, which I certainly didn't agree with. And I'm capable of separating the wheat from chaff in many of these arguments, because when I found in many of the criticisms of Lincoln from people like Ron Paul and Judge Napolitano was that there were some grains of truth there. However, being the contrarian that I was willing to disbelieve some of my heroes on this question. And then one day I came into contact with a man by the name of Lou Lehrman. Now this is all very insider baseball stuff, so if you're not a big Civil War buff or history nerd, I was thinking about talking about Sarah Silverman and the Nazi swastika stuff, because I knew that would get tens of thousands of views on YouTube. But I decided, why not just continue to keep it real, be educational, talk about the issues that really matter, talk about history, because you know what? I think that stuff is cool. But in terms of my belief system, I started to I started to drink the Kool-Aid, if you will, about what Ron Paul and Judge Napolitano thought about Abraham Lincoln and about the cause of the Confederacy, the Southern cause. And so when I listen there to Ron Paul, of course, I have to say that I do disagree with what Dr. Ron Paul had to say. And we're going to talk about it, and this is the kind of thing where it puts me, again, in a contrary position to many in the liberty movement. Many of the people who argue for the cause, the Southern cause, I think are taking up the wrong cause. So when I was a young boy, I was a Billy Yank. As I got older, I sided a little bit more with Johnny Reb. And then when I became a full-grown adult man, I realized, to hell with both of them. And that's what the real libertarian position on this is, to hell with both of them, because they were both defending slaveholding governments. Both of the governments had slaves and had defended slavery at many times. But in terms of which one was worse, I'd have to say they were both pretty bad, but at least one of those governments was attempting to end slavery. And of course, Dr. Ron Paul states that other countries bought up the slaves, and this puts him a bit at odds with Murray Rothbard, who made an argument that I think was really fascinating, because many times you'll hear libertarians saying, well, of course, we didn't need a bloody war because every other country did it. Well, other countries, if you look at it even modern terms, other countries are nowhere near as violent as the United States. And so it's a bit of a misnomer there to think that the United States could avoid this without a civil war. I mean, libertarians even argue you shouldn't have to give up your private property, right? And certainly the Southern abolitionists believed that the slaves were private property. The question of whether or not Civil War was about slavery or not, we can leave it off for just a moment. But what Dr. Ron Paul was suggesting there was simply buying up the slaves and recompensating the slave owners for, in essence, committing a crime against individual liberty there. So Dr. Ron Paul is very wrong about this subject. Because, of course, you should not buy slaves, because slaves are not to be bought. Slaves are human beings, and they should be freed by violence if necessary. I like to think of it like this. Let's say that you were, there have been examples of this, you had a slave in your basement. You had a sex slave, for example. And this has happened before, and even in recent American history, where you were a captive in your basement. And the question is, should you walk in and buy the slave? Should you buy the person? Should you pay a ransom for that person to free them? Why would you do that when you could just walk in and with the SWAT team and kill the captors and free the slaves? That's what slavers deserve, is death. And that's what libertarians believe, because if we believe that taxation is theft, if we believe that we are serfs, then revolution, slave revolution, like they tried many times, like what happened with John Brown at Harper's Ferry, which we're going to get into in just a moment, that's what libertarians believe. And the idea that you would buy up the slaves seems to me anti-libertarian, and I think Murray Rothbard agreed when he said there was only one possible moral solution to the slave question: immediate and unconditional abolition with no compensation to the slave masters. Indeed, any compensation should have been the other way, to repay the oppressed slaves for their lifetime of slavery. Now, I know a lot of people want to talk about Cal-Exit and Texit and all that stuff because it's in a modern context, but let's talk about all these things and talk about the modern context at the very end. I don't want to front load that stuff just because there's too much speculation. Let's talk about the facts here. But Murray Rothbard says that any compensation should have been the other way around, to repay the oppressed slaves for their lifetime of slavery. Now, are you telling me that the Southern abolitionists were going to allow this, that they were going to be forced not only to give up their slaves, abolition of their slaves, but that they would be forced to make repayments to the slaves at the time? There was no way they were going to do that. They believed those slaves were their violent property. Now, when it comes to the question of whether or not the Civil War was about slavery, it absolutely was about slavery. It may not have been the only cause that led up to the Civil War, but slavery was a primary cause. Of course, many people don't know that it was the raid on Harper's Ferry, where Robert E. Lee was there, that John Brown committed and was ultimately hanged for, that sparked the rise of militias in the South to be organized into the Confederate Army. So if it wasn't about slavery, if the war wasn't about slavery, why did they arm the militias? Well, they armed the militias because of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And of course, there was a bloody war that was sparked because of it. But Murray Rothbard seems to be in disagreement with Ron Paul here. I'm agreeing with Murray Rothbard, saying that there should have been unconditional abolition and no compensation to the slave masters. You know, the problem is that, of course, in a free market, if people are in a free market, if a human being is a slave, is being sold in the free market, you actually create more of an incentive for people to buy and sell slaves the more slaves you buy, right? Supply and demand. So if you go in and you purchase up all of the slaves, well, that just gives the slaveholder more money to go out and buy slaves. So I think that it's wrong-headed for libertarians to support the Confederacy for that reason. And I think that a lot of it comes down to contrarianism. I think that a lot of it comes down to the drinking of the Kool-Aid that we have in the movement from the neo-Confederate wing. And they are there. They argue very vehemently for their positions. They say that it wasn't about slavery. Of course, you'd have to ignore the Declaration of Independence, which was almost deep-sixed itself for the primary cause of slavery. The Declaration of Independence, actually, many people don't know, almost didn't happen simply because South Carolina walked out of the delegation, along with the rest of the Southern delegation, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams attempted to end slavery at the beginning of the War of American Independence. There's a great musical, if you're into musicals, you should watch 1776, the musical, and it dramatizes the events that happened at the Philadelphia Convention, where the delegates attempted to end slavery, and of course the South, relying on slavery, walked out. Now, another argument for why the Civil War absolutely was about slavery would be simply because the South said it was. The South said specifically in their Articles of Secession, which you should read, the articles which I'll read portions of here, the Articles of Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and South Carolina, you should read. They say that they were thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, in his cornerstone speech, wrote specifically that it was their peculiar institution, but that was part of their way of life. Now, if you know one thing about people in the United States is that they do not give up their private property without a fight. So the question of whether or not the Civil War was about slavery, it unquestionably was. And you can talk about tariffs, you can talk about economic reasons between the North and South, but the plain fact of the matter is that the militias were formed because of the raid on Harper's Ferry, and that the Confederacy fired first on Fort Sumter because they claimed that was within Southern land. Well, we took a bloody war to get to a court decision, which we'll talk about in here in just a moment, Texas versus White. So if we're talking about secession, you have to consider certain things. You have to talk about the way that the United States government was founded in 1786, the way that the Constitution was put together. The Declaration of Independence, again, almost got rid of slavery, but the Founding Fathers had to get rid of it in order to pass independence. And of course, the slavery was a black stain on America's legacy ever since. But then also you have to consider, when it comes to the way that the Constitution was created, the states didn't create the federal government. And a lot of conservatives and neo-Confederates and even some libertarians will sometimes argue in favor of states' rights, which is a misnomer. Because, of course, as libertarians, we hold the individual above the state, right? The state we do not serve the state. That's what communists believe. We serve the individual, the rights of the individual. And of course, the states did not create the federal government. This was a major argument in the ratification of the Constitution, because the Constitution of the United States reads, "We the people," not "we the states." And people like Patrick Henry had a problem with that, because they thought that there might be a chance that one day they would want to bolt. The Anti-Federalists even stated that in the Anti-Federalist Papers, that there will be a civil war if this Constitution is passed. And of course, we saw that was absolutely true. So let's take a look at, I want to finish this, of course, laying out the framing of the debate. We're going to talk about secession now, of course. The secessionist argument does not hold water from a legal perspective. Now, now think about this. Not at least as the Constitution is currently written. Secession, now this is the brain buster part, and I want you guys to follow along with me on this. Secession can be legal and moral. It can be illegal and moral. And it can be illegal and immoral, right? Those are the consequences. It can also be legal and immoral, right? Not all secessions are created equal. But in the United States, all citizens are created equal and are to be held such before the eyes of the law. There are no states' rights. There are only individual rights, and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution codifies that concept into the rule of law. Of course, the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment were the Civil War era amendments, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th establishing citizenship and declaring that all persons within U.S. jurisdiction are entitled to equal protections under the law. You cannot say, of course, that 600,000 American citizens didn't die for slavery when the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment were passed immediately after to free the slaves. Of course, that war was about slavery. And of course, I've heard all of the arguments against this, and they just don't hold water with me anymore. So this is where I part ways with some of the Mises Institute or people like even my good friend and former boss, Judge Napolitano. I happen to disagree with him on this. I happen to disagree with Ron Paul on this. It doesn't mean that I don't respect them or think that they're not great men. I just happen to think that they're wrong on this issue, and Murray Rothbard just happened to be right on this question. And again, I don't even agree with Murray Rothbard. But we're going to talk about secession, of course, but I want to talk about some of the major figures of the Civil War that I think have been unfairly demonized by libertarians. Well, as a contrarian, I'm going to go against the grain here and may not make a lot of libertarians happy, but I think we need to hear this because I think it's actually one, if you're talking about primary causes for defeats, the arguments for the Confederacy, for the push to push for the lost cause is actually, I think, one of the big reasons why the libertarian movement is held back, why we're stunted, why we lose on a national scene. If you don't know the history of the paleo strategy, I'm not going to get into it in the newsletters and all that stuff, but you need to look up the paleo strategy by Murray Rothbard and what happened with many of the libertarians where they wanted to get in bed with the neo-Confederates, which what they called racist rednecks at the time, in order to build a libertarian movement that based on the concepts of populism, which is very, of course, interesting, of course, because we see the alt-right now, the rise of the alt-right, where the paleo-conservative populists have gone on and won a big victory now with Donald Trump. And of course, the libertarian movement is now a rump movement because we've lost many of these people who support a cause that I believe is antithetical to individual rights and individual liberty. And again, just because you don't support the Confederacy doesn't mean that you can't say that there weren't great wrongs committed by the North. There absolutely were. That's what happens in wartime. But I think that some of the characters of the Civil War have been, again, unfairly demonized by libertarians. So I'm going to provide you with some revisionist history to the revisionist history so that we can have a better understanding of our history and that we as libertarians are not so, we don't drink it in Kool-Aid so much, as they say. So I have here a fantastic piece written by Ian Hewitt. This was written a few years ago for the Libertarian Republic, 2014. And this was written about, this is a libertarian defense of John Brown. Frequently we would see libertarians saying that, oh, John Brown was a murderer and he was an insurrectionist and it was good that he was killed because, of course, there's a lot of sympathy for the Confederate cause in our circles. Not as much anymore now, but I think that there deserves to be a libertarian defense of John Brown, and Ian Hewitt has written a terrific one that I want to read to you all as well. Many Americans are familiar with Julia Ward Howe's patriotic anthem, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the one that I was playing earlier. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Also known as Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory. Relatively few, however, know that Howe's Righteous Chorale was an adaptation of a pre-existing song called John Brown's a Body. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave. Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. His truth is marching on. So it was actually John Brown that originated, or his death that culminated in the beginning of that song, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. And this is, of course, Ian writing. He's a Kansan. I'm a Missourian. We were a slave state. Sorry, Ian. Go Kansas on that one, of course. Kansas took the right side on that issue. As a Kansan of libertarian temperament, I've respected John Brown since I learned about the militant abolitionist in school. A devout Christian, Brown understood and lived by the call to action of Matthew 25:45. He resisted federal efforts to enforce slavery, fought to protect Kansan sovereignty, and ultimately gave his life for the cause of abolition. The Libertarian Republic, for these reasons, sometimes makes use of John Brown's image. When we do, I'm reminded that not everyone shares the perception of John Brown that I developed as a student. A small but outspoken segment of our readership typically reacts by indignantly condemning Brown as a terrorist who butchered innocent people and or heralded tyrannical policies. A few of these people, unfortunately, seem to have gotten so carried away in their criticism of Abraham Lincoln that they've found themselves defending border ruffians. This is ironic. Far from defending states' rights or any other kind of rights, the pro-slavery side of the bleeding Kansas conflict was fighting to impose slavery on the anti-slavery Sunflower State. I'm persuaded, however, that many of John Brown's detractors are simply uninformed about the facts and circumstances of John Brown's actions, which we're going to get into. I'd like to follow the following points in my more sympathetic view of John Brown. The Potawatomi Massacre, easily the most controversial of Brown's actions, is frequently misrepresented. It is true that John Brown and his men conducted a series of executions in Franklin County in 1856. It is, however, a lazy misrepresentation to assert, as many do, that Brown went about haphazardly cutting down entire families. As Brown and his men carried out the Potawatomi killings, a response to violent attacks by pro-slavery forces, they specifically targeted professional slave hunters and militant pro-slavery fighters. As the abolitionists moved from house to house, they spared not only all the women and children they encountered, but several men who determined that they were not involved in the bleeding Kansas conflict. At the cabin of James Harris, for example, the Free State men found 6 residents, including 4 men. After questioning the men, the abolitionists executed only one, William Sherman, and allowed the rest to go free. Hardly the work of terrorists wantonly butchering anyone in their path. John Brown resisted federal tyranny. Libertarians ought to appreciate the political context of John Brown's actions. The League of Gileadites, the first incarnation of Brown's anti-slavery militia, was formed in direct response to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. By protecting escaped slaves from federally sanctioned capture and extradition, the League effectively nullified this federal law. Fittingly, John Brown's action was the seizure of a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. From the beginning to the end of his career, Brown fought against slavery by resisting its imposition through overreaching power. John Brown's life, then, is a stark repudiation of political centralization. In the United States, the defeat of slavery is a favorite talking point of those who extol the goodness of unitary control. Yet John Brown reminds us that slavery was projected and prolonged because free states were not allowed to manage their own internal affairs. Long before the official end of slavery, John Brown fought and died resisting a federal government that actively enforced it. Frederick Douglass, moreover, credited Brown with playing an indispensable role in slavery's eventual end. John Brown not only shows us that centralized power was used for evil where we credit it with good, but he demands ultimate credit for the good that was ultimately done. Douglass was not the only respectable figure to offer words of praise for Brown. While not condoning all of Brown's actions, eloquent Quaker lyricist John Greenleaf Whittier lionized Brown in romantic verse, calling his death a Christian sacrifice. Whittier was an early and prominent advocate of nullifying fugitive slave laws. Libertarians, in particular, may appreciate that the political philosopher Lysander Spooner conspired to promote John Brown's activities. That's right, anarcho-capitalists who don't believe in the Constitution of the United States. None other than Lysander Spooner conspired to promote John Brown's activities. Also, Henry David Thoreau offered a bold and unapologetic plea for Captain John Brown comparing the federal government to Pontius Pilate and proclaiming that Brown, quote, did not recognize unjust human laws, but resisted them as he was bid. Like these thinkers, readers of the Libertarian Republic should take another look at the compelling legacy of this easily misunderstood figure. The roster of people who have seen good in Brown is an illustrious one. You may decide to count yourself among them. As a Kansan, I'm convinced that John Brown has made a lasting contribution to the defiant spirit of my state. Last April, which would have been 4 years ago, Kansas legislature successfully passed a bill nullifying federal gun laws in the Sunflower State. I don't think it's a coincidence that they did so in a Capitol building adorned with a furious mural of John Brown. So, there is a little bit of a revision for the Libertarian revisionist history on John Brown. Did you learn something new there? Very interesting argument there, and it's kind of the thing that, it's the kind of thing that makes you question. And some people who are watching my live now think that I don't read the chat, but I am reading the chat. I'm watching everything and listening to everything that you're saying, so it's time for us to transition now. So while we do, I want to do a quick plug, of course. This is the Capitalist. Lysander Spooner was not a very good capitalist, but I am. And so if you like the Make Taxation Theft Again hat, you can find this and many other cool products at threadsofliberty.com. That's threadsofliberty.com. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you're getting an ad playing. That's what happens. This is how we make money. If you're enjoying the stream, don't forget to share us afterwards. If you're watching us on Facebook right now, share us as well. And again, you can get this cool hat at threadsofliberty.com. Glory, glory, hallelujah to capitalism. So on the next question, another major figure that I think has been in some ways unfairly demonized, in some ways fairly demonized, but in other ways I think unfairly demonized for his role in the Civil War, and that is Abraham Lincoln. And our former editor-in-chief, now associate editor, Josh Guckert, wrote a really terrific little short piece about how libertarians should approach Abraham Lincoln, and I think he's done a pretty fantastic job of summarizing some of the good points that we ought to take a look at here when considering Abraham Lincoln. And if you really want to get, again, the best opinions on this, the person who started to change my mind, the person who told me to put down the Kool-Aid, was a very libertarian gentleman by the name of Lou Lehrman. I didn't get to finish that story earlier, but if you've never heard of Louis Lehrman, he actually was a hardcore libertarian who sat with Ron Paul on Ronald Reagan's Gold Commission in the early 1980s, and he voted with Ron Paul on returning the United States to a gold standard. So this is no like big government apologist here. This is a Ron Paul loving libertarian by the name of Lou Lehrman, and I know him because I had him on my show Freedom Watch with Judge Napolitano frequently, and because we would debate about Abraham Lincoln, and I was giving him some of the Tom DiLorenzo talking points. I was arguing about tariffs and states' rights and blah blah blah, and he was presenting many of the arguments that he made in his book that I would encourage you to read, called Lincoln at Peoria, Turning Point. And essentially he argues in this about Lincoln's true beliefs about slavery, which many people, of course, look at him in some of his public statements and say, hey, Lincoln was an absolute abject racist. He didn't care about freeing the slaves. He just wanted to keep the Union together. Many of this was absolutely true. But Lincoln, like many people, underwent a transformation in his thoughts and minds, like anyone. And like I underwent a transformation in my thoughts, in my heart, in my minds, about the true causes for the Civil War and whether or not secession itself is legal, moral, or constitutional, which I will get into at the end of the show. But let's talk about how libertarians should approach Lincoln. This is, again, by Josh Guckert. There's perhaps no topic that exhibits the wide divide between the general public and libertarian circles as much as the discussion of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. While Lincoln is ranked by nearly every historian as either the first or second best president, one cannot discuss the Civil War with many libertarians without them decrying Lincoln's tyrannical actions as president. With Lincoln celebrating his 206th birthday, this was last year, so 207th now, it was yesterday, I feel it fitting to examine just how libertarians should analyze the former president's legacy. Don't tell me what to do, Josh Guckert. Don't tell me how I should approach Lincoln's legacy. That's not libertarian, Josh. I completely, I abolish this article and I won't listen to it because you've committed a grave sin, To begin, there is no question that Lincoln's legacy has been immensely fictionalized over the past 150 years, perhaps because his leadership is during wartime. Oop, lost my spot there. Perhaps because of his leadership during wartime, apparent opposition to slavery, assassination at a fairly young age, or some combination of all three. Lincoln is remembered by most Americans as one of the greatest leaders and most noble men in our country's history. Needless to say, we should always be careful when engaging in such hero worship, no matter what historical figure we're observing. Libertarians will often point out that Lincoln was one of the first, quote, imperial American presidents. He suspended the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and his actions blockading southern ports led to the prize cases, where the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled his actions unconstitutional. In order to fund the Civil War, Lincoln enacted the first federal income tax, boo, including the predecessor to the IRS, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Lastly, many libertarians claim that the southern states had the constitutional right to secession, and therefore Lincoln was wrong to attempt to stop them from doing so. All of these are valid criticisms of Lincoln, but what is problematic is when these libertarians shift their admiration to the Confederacy. As pointed out by libertarian and historian Jason Kuznicki, the southern states' reasons for leaving the Union was not to exercise their constitutional rights, but rather explicitly to protect slavery. They claimed to abhor the federal government's intervention in their states' economies. But they openly lobbied for it when it was necessary to maintain slavery, like with the Fugitive Slave Act. Like most people and most governments, they want to have their cake and eat it too. No, not Gary Johnson. Once the new CSA was founded, conscription was enacted, and, quote, big government quickly reared its head in the South. Taking these facts and using them to examine how we should discuss Lincoln in the modern era, we should tread lightly. It is fair to challenge Lincoln's likely unconstitutional actions during the course of the Civil War. It is important to learn lessons from each side's mistakes in attempting to further the cause of liberty. However, it does not do our movement any good to zero in on Lincoln and attempt to refashion common thought through ad hominem attacks on his presidency. Lincoln is perhaps the perfect example of how we should and should not approach so many issues when discussing with those outside the liberty movement. We cannot bring our own narratives into a conversation and expect them to be readily accepted. We must be sympathetic to opposition voices and take into account what we know is the general consensus. Of course, absolutely. I do that all the time. If I know that I'm in the minority, then I tend to listen to them first because there's a chance that I could be wrong. Just because you're in the minority, libertarians, we tend to think, oh, well, as contrarians, well, we must be right if the majority are for it, because we have that natural contrarian streak. Also, we cannot use our criticisms of Lincoln as a way of sympathizing with the Confederate States. The only thing worse than attacking a universally beloved figure is connecting our movement to a nation whose legacy is synonymous with slavery, which is perhaps the most anti-liberty institution in history. To that effect, we shouldn't invoke the Confederate flag or other symbols of that era while advocating for liberty. Additionally, it is far too often that I hear libertarians proudly say Sic Semper Tyrannis, which are the first words of John Wilkes Booth after he murdered Lincoln. And of course, but then Josh, and I might differ with my former editor on this point, of course the state flag of Virginia says Sic Semper Tyrannis. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean the assassination of President Lincoln. It could also mean thus always to tyrants. Josh closes in saying that it's difficult to discuss legendary and controversial figures like Lincoln, those which are viewed in one way by nearly all Americans and another by the Liberty Movement. Lincoln's legacy is especially different, as it's been long entrenched in people's minds, and therefore most will be resistant to changing their thinking. We should use this singular figure as a broader lesson on how to spread the message of liberty. So Josh here is being a bit scoldish right here, so I don't necessarily agree with Josh's tone, perhaps, but I do think that he does have some nuggets of wisdom here when he says how to approach talking to the general public about the Civil War and the Confederacy. For example, what we saw with Ron Paul earlier on Meet the Press, that alienated a lot of people. I know for a fact because I was actually watching that interview in the morning with a group of Republicans, and of course Ron Paul was a Republican, was running for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party, and the entire group of Republicans who he needed to support him suddenly were angry with him. But there are, if you want to talk about rhetoric, there are some libertarian aspects of freeing the slaves. You could find some libertarian aspects in order to provide a more appealing message to the people that you're trying to win over, if your goal is to win an election, which ostensibly he was trying to do. But of course, if you're just trying to educate people and you're not trying to win, well then of course alienating people and making them angry it's libertarianism de jure. It's what we love to do, is we love to tick people off and make people angry. It's what I'm doing right now. I'm making a lot of libertarians angry. But of course, if we don't police our own, then we will be policed. Now, the big question, or actually, not the big question, we're almost there. This is going to be a long live stream tonight, guys. I hope you don't mind. It's already 34 minutes. Let's just keep going and talking about this stuff because it's too big, it's too important, personally, I don't care. 100 people are watching right now, so screw it. You get a good long show. We're going to ask the question, is secession racist? And then I'm going to answer the question of whether or not I think that it's time for secession. And then we'll talk about the historical context, and then we'll finish by talking about the modern secessionist movements. This is written by me at the Libertarian Republic. Is secession racist? And this was written in 2012 when there was a huge petition effort to secede from the federal government so in 2012. Consider that when you hear the context here. Almost 1 million American citizens have petitioned the White House in recent weeks to secede from the Union. That is more than the amount of people who died in the war between the states. Anti-government sentiment in the United States is at an all-time high, and job performance opinions of Congress are very low. That hasn't changed. The nation seems gripped with Civil War fever in light of the secession issue and the success of the recent historical motion picture biopic, Lincoln. A great many of the social democratic underclass responded quickly with demands that petitioners be stripped of their citizenship. Sound familiar? Remember somebody who was pushing recently to strip the citizenship of people who burn flags? That's a left and righty issue there. Documentarian Ken Burns was quick to point out the secessionists and those who opposed the elevation of Ambassador Susan Rice to Secretary of State were probably racist. But is secession racist? The truth is, it depends. Of course, the concept of secession in and of itself is not racist by definition. Secession is merely a political separation of a region away from a governing authority. The United States seceded over England over issues of taxation, economics, war, and civil liberty. Catalonia was attempting to separate from Spain at the time for similar reasons. As Spain suffered from the Euro crisis, Catalonia was trying to get more say in how their finances are used. And seeing as how they make up 20% of the Spanish economy, it's no wonder that they're attempting to separate from the rest of the nation that benefits greatly from that productive region. Congressman Ron Paul, a Libertarian Republican from Texas, who we all know, stated that secession is a deeply American principle. He said there is nothing treasonous or unpatriotic about wanting a federal government that is more responsive to the people it represents. Well, you're being a little wiggly there. You're being just a tiny bit wormy there when you say that, because nothing treasonous or unpatriotic in wanting a federal government that's more responsive. Well, that would mean that you're staying within the federal government and you're trying to get it to be more responsive. That's not treasonous or unpatriotic. But if you secede, technically you are committing treason and being unpatriotic against that government. So I'm not going to let you out of that one, Dr. Ron Paul. Indeed, secession may be deeply patriotic if done for the purpose of liberty and independence. It's widely known amongst historians that it was Northern abolitionists who were the first to advocate for secession in the United States from the South. Antebellum abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison famously quipped that the Constitution was, quote, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, because he believed that it permitted slavery. Social Democrats who revere the Dalai Lama and are for a, quote, free Tibet are in essence advocating for secession from China. So it is very curious that they would have such a knee-jerk reaction to those petitions. Or I would think it was curious if I was not aware that House Democrats are deliberately coached to declare any opposition to a government program or institution as racist. Yes, they are deliberately coached to do that. Despite social democrat ad hominems, it is certain that from Catalonia to Tibet, there are plenty of clear cases of historical and modern-day secession that are not racist. But were the Confederate States of America in 1860 seceding for racist reasons? Absolutely. In the Articles of Secession filed by the state of Texas, it read, quote, Texas was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery. the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that has existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intend should exist in all future time. They intended for slavery to exist for all future time. And Mississippi, quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. You can hear them saying it in that accent. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions and an imperious law of nature. None but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities in the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. What can we conclude from this? It seems fairly clear that secession itself is not racist, but it is possible to desire to secede for racist reasons. The question, therefore, is not, is secession racist? The question is secession morally or legally acceptable? The moral issue. The ethics of separation to any libertarian are simple. Anyone should be able to voluntarily withdraw from any contract that is voluntarily entered, but free people have the right to alter or abolish any government that becomes hostile to their life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness. That precedent was established in the Declaration of Independence. Catalonia or Tibet have every right to secede and enjoy the same independence that Americans now enjoy. However, it is not ethical to secede for the express purpose of violating individual rights of others. Secession for the clear stated purpose of subjugating other individuals and denying them natural rights is illegitimate and unethical. And of course, if you look at the Free Tibet movement with the attempt to restore the Lama class to Tibet, you have to question what would they do if they were back in power. And there were all sorts of brutalities committed by the Lama class while they were in power in Tibet. Actually, China, in taking over Tibet, instituted democratic reforms. And the Lama class were murdering and enslaving people in the basements of their temples. So you have to take a look at the record of the Dalai Lama. And, it's the kind of thing that will actually give you pause if you consider yourself a social democrat and if you're considering someone who believes in a free Tibet. What form of government are you replacing with? Are you replacing it with a worse form of government, a more tyrannical form of government? That lies at the moral question. But now it's the legal question that we are about to discuss right now. I make nobody happy talking about this, by the way. Like, Democrats are angry at me, Libertarians are mad at me, Republicans are mad. Everybody hates me, but I'm just reading the facts, man. Secession in the United States is absolutely illegal under current American law. If the brutal war of Northern aggression and Southern ignorance wasn't enough to convince you, then the Supreme Court case of Texas versus White should be. In this 1869 Reconstruction era case, it was decided that despite Texas having joined the Confederacy, it had always remained a state. Secession hadn't technically occurred, and the entire war was written off as a rebellion in the eyes of the U.S. government. In the film Lincoln, director Steven Spielberg sets the story in the background of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment of the United States was passed to outlaw slavery and involuntary servitude. There were two major attempts at passing this amendment before the Civil War to stop the conflict. So you see, if it wasn't about slavery, then why were they trying to pass the 13th Amendment before the war broke out? Now, there was another amendment, the Corwin Amendment, which was a measure proposed and passed by the government that effectively would make slavery legal for all time, but it was ignored by the Confederacy, who had already committed to independence. Abraham Lincoln supported the amendment in his inaugural address, stating, "I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen, has passed Congress to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. Holding such a provision now to be now implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable." America appears now to be very lucky that Lincoln was not given the option to commit to the Corwin Amendment. Had the Southern states not gone out of their way to provoke hostilities, Lincoln could have permanently ingrained slavery in our Constitution for all time. Because of the war, America was able to pass the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery and involuntary servitude indefinitely. So yes, Ron Paul, you are absolutely wrong. A war was necessary in order to end slavery. Looking at the Gettysburg Address with a fresh perspective from the Corwin Amendment, it's no wonder that the sage of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, criticized Lincoln's famous speech as disingenuous when Mencken wrote, he talked about, Mencken's talking about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This is what H.L. Mencken wrote about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It is eloquence brought to a pellucid and almost childlike perfection, the highest emotion reduced to one graceful and irresistible gesture. Nothing else precisely like it is to be found in the whole range of oratory. Lincoln himself never even remotely approached it. It is genuinely stupendous, but let us not forget that it is poetry, not logic, beauty, not sense. Think of the argument in it. Put it into the cold words of every day. The doctrine is simply this, that the Union soldiers who died at Gettysburg sacrificed their lives to the cause of self-determination. Quote, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from this earth. It's difficult to imagine anything more untrue. Again, this is Mencken's words. The Union soldiers in that battle actually fought against self-determination. It was the Confederates who fought for the right of the people to govern themselves. What was the practical effect of the Battle of Gettysburg? What else than the destruction of the old sovereignty of the states, i.e. the people of the states? The Confederates went into the battle free. They came out with their freedom subject to the supervision and veto of the rest of the country, and for nearly 20 years that veto was so effective that they enjoyed scarcely more liberty in the political sense than so many convicts in the penitentiary. So H.L. Mencken makes a very lucid argument, although one that I believe contradicts logic, because in the end, the Southerners were not fighting for, they were fighting for sovereignty, but of course as Libertarians we don't believe in state sovereignty, we believe in individual sovereignty. So if we don't believe in state sovereignty, we believe only in individual sovereignty, then it was the Union soldiers fighting to free slaves. It doesn't matter if the individual soldiers didn't fight to free slaves, because it was the outcome of it. But when they did, it was actually the Union who was fighting for self-determination on an individual level. In terms of sovereignty, if you believe in states' rights, well, of course, then you would be on the side of the Confederacy and you would be in the arms of statism. But is secession inherently racist? No, not if done for the express purpose of advancing individual liberty. But are Democrats who use racism as a tactic to further their agenda racist? Undoubtedly, yes. And so that's really the question of whether or not secession is racist. No, as a concept, it's not racist. But if you do it for racist means, then of course it can be used for racist means. And that's really the question of whether or not secession is racist. The answer to that question is no, but it can be used for racist means. Now, the big question, the one that we've all come here for tonight, to talk about whether or not it is time for states to secede from the Union. Now, keep in mind, I wrote this article back in 2012 when secession fever was a big deal, with the big 80,000 signatures that were pushed in. And this is the big argument about whether or not it's time for the states to secede from the Union. And I've made my argument here about what I think about whether or not it's time to secede from the Union. We'll see if my opinion has changed from 2012 to 2017. It's been a long time. I've been fighting for liberty for a long time. Citizens from 30 of 50 states in America have filed for secession from the Union. Barack Obama's website petition ranks Texas alone as having over 80,000 signatures. Petitions receiving more than 25,000 signatures qualify for an official response for the White House. The president is honor-bound, but not legally required to make a statement to citizens who are demanding that they be allowed to break away and form separate, sovereign republics. When Benjamin Franklin first began diplomatic negotiations with the British before the War of Independence, he was undoubtedly on the side of the Loyalists. However, as a long train of abuses and usurpations made it abundantly clear that there would be taxation without representation, self-written search warrants by soldiers, and the endangerment of American trade via British imperialism, because if Britain were to declare war, all of her colonies were at war as well, Franklin decided it was time to separate and declare independence from King George III. He was one of the last of the founders to do so. America was built on secession. After her successful break from Britain, the Union was established to, quote, secure these rights among men. The Constitution, as it was written, was a great compromise at a convention built on guile and intrigue amongst America's founding fathers. The competing factions at the Hall in Philadelphia ultimately sowed the seeds for the partisan divide in politics that we have today. Federalists wanted a strong central government. Anti-Federalists wanted none of it. The Federalists won, and the Anti-Federalists backstopped our liberties the best they could with a Bill of Rights. These United States were born. We successfully seceded. There was secession again in 1860 when the many states of the South formed a compact, a confederacy, to maintain certain economic liberties as well as the practice of chattel slavery. These Americans risked their lives for principles that were right and for some that were undoubtedly wrong. Ultimately, because of their loss, our nation became stronger in some ways and weaker in others. For the price of freeing the slaves, we slammed shut the door that would allow the states to peacefully withdraw from a union they peacefully joined. We still do honor the Confederacy in this country. We do not honor these men because of slavery, however. We honor them because of their willingness to sacrifice their lives for the spirit of independence. President Barack Obama acknowledged this when he deliberately laid a wreath at the Confederate Memorial at Arlington despite pleas from his supporters to cease. He rightfully understood that the events of the struggle were more than just one issue, and that the 750,000 men who died did not do so in vain. There were very real ideas at stake in this war, and both sides had principles that were correct. Most of these principles would remain when the wartime income tax was declared unconstitutional and the U.S. was placed on a gold standard for a short period. Now, fresh on the heels of President Obama's re-election, back in 2012, of course, comes the wave of petitions for their states to be independent. Doubtless, many Americans are reeling from the expectations of tax increases on small business owners, the implementation costs of Obamacare, and the long-term effects of a $16 trillion debt. Oh, I miss a $16 trillion debt, don't you? Many of them are feeling desperate and without options to escape the crushing burden of taxation, debt, and regulations inflicted on them by an uncaring federal government. But is it time to secede again? My answer, no. And here's why. The topic of secession is not uncommon in D.C. socialite circles. It will often go to the American Civil War and whether or not states should be added or be allowed to secede. As a test of my audiences, I like to ask a simple question and gauge people's responses. My question is, if the state of California decided to secede over federal drug raids or because they wanted gay marriage, would you advocate that we roll tank into Sacramento? If they say no, then I respond, then you're a Confederate. And think about this. If Puerto Rico, which recently voted in favor of statehood, were to join the Union and then 4 years later decide to leave, would you advocate we invade and kill the citizens of that island? Some people do suggest that we respond with violence. Supporters of the president and his agenda have launched their own petitions asking that those who signed a secession petition be stripped of their citizenship. But why, if you believe in union, do you suggest those who wish to leave be stripped of their rights? Are we going to ship them off to Gitmo next? Some secessionists point to the Declaration of Independence as their document that gives them claim to secession. The words are, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. This seems to give us the idea that we do have a right to alter or abolish our forms of government, and I would agree in theory. However, one glaring problem with the Declaration is that it is not the law of the land. As a legal document, the Declaration only holds weight insofar as it created a temporary union to defeat Great Britain. It is not used today as a legal document or a precedent other than a symbolic one. Citizens of the United States are descendants of the tradition of secession, but the formation of the Constitution created a system of positive law, rather than natural law that the framers instilled into the Declaration. America is not operating under the Articles of Confederation, and thus the Declaration of Independence is not applicable in this case. If citizens were to write a new one, however, that might be a different story. But despite all this, should we retain the right to alter our government or even abolish it? Undoubtedly, yes. Thomas Paine once wrote, quote, "The Parliament or the people of 1688 or any other period have no more right to dispose of the people of present day, or to bind or control them in any shape whatever, than the Parliament or the people of the present day have to dispose, bind, or control those who are to live 100, 1,000 years hence. Every generation is, and must be, competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living, and not the dead, that are to be accommodated. When man ceases to be, his power and his wants cease with him. And having no longer any participation in the concerns of this world, he no longer has any authority in directing who shall be its governors, or how its government shall be organized, or how administered. It is sensible to understand that men who died long ago cannot bind future generations permanently to any set of laws or document." Lysander Spooner, abolitionist and entrepreneur, illustrated it this way. If a father builds a house for a family, can he compel them to live in it? If he plants a fruit tree for his children to eat one day, can he compel them to eat from it? Of course not. So then it must be understood that the citizens of the United States cannot be compelled to toil forever under a constitution that is so obviously defunct in our modern era. Spooner went on to explain in his treatise, No Treason, that, quote, "The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation. It has no authority or obligation at all, unless as a contract between a man and a man. And it does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. It purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago." Of course, it was written the essay was written in 1869. "And it can be supposed to have been a contract then only between persons who had already come to years of discretion, so as to be competent to make reasonable and obligatory contracts. Furthermore, we know historically that only a small portion even of the people then existing were consulted on the subject, or asked, or permitted to express either their dissent or consent in any formal matter. Those persons, if any, who did give their consent formally are all dead now." Yes, but there are quite a few fallacies in what Lysander Spooner has argued here. I don't have time to get into all of them because we're going way long, and we still got 100 people watching, so whatever, you guys are enjoying. So I'm just going to keep rocking and rolling. But if we are not to be governed under the Constitution forever, what should be our guide going forward? Paine and Spooner are correct in that we cannot forever be bound by one system of laws written by people long gone. We must be able to adapt to change. The question is, are we stronger individually if we act as a union, or would we be stronger independently as sovereign republics? The author of this piece, me, believes that now is not the time for secession, despite the usurpations of rights that we are currently suffering. Having traveled from sea to sea in this great nation over the past few years, it's convinced me of the individual benefits that we as Americans receive to be able to travel freely from state to state. And now with people talking about building a wall with Mexico, the last thing we want to see is a wall between Kansas and Missouri. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, living in New York City for 8 years, and now in Washington, D.C. at the time for 4, I've witnessed more beauty in one nation that could ever exist in any heaven anyone ever dreamed of. To secede might mean to lose access to the wilds of New Hampshire should they shut us out. How tragic would be the loss of Texas or California if they refused to recognize your citizenship from a neighboring state? Would we really want to see them shut down and turn their southern border into a militarized zone? Is that a vision of a peaceful future that we wish to leave for our children? We need less walls, not more. Way to go, Austin. 2012, Austin. Now is a time for unity and for us to resist tyranny, not retreat. The Libertarian movement has a saying we like to repeat from the Latin. Tunacere malis, sed contra audentior ito. It means, do not give in to evil, but proceed ever more boldly against it. The citizens of America have a duty not to shrink away from evil. We should proceed boldly against it. Our forefathers brought forth unto this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. And though we have lost our way many times, we have also gained many rights and privileges as well, including the abolition of chattel slavery and women's suffrage, as well as civil rights. From California to New York City and everything in between, we the citizens of the United States are blessed to live in a free nation. If we have oppressive government, then we should not shrink away from it in resignation. Don't give up the fight for individual liberty and cede ground to the forced unionists who talk of liberty but demand ever-increasing taxation. A quick look at the electoral map from the 2012 election shows that only a tiny portion of the country is blue. The red far outpaces them in terms of overall territory. You would cede ground to these tiny holdouts of progressivism? You want to take your ball and go home and just give up on the rest of the nation? What about the liberties of those in your neighboring states? Do they not deserve to be free of socialized medicine and confiscatory taxes? Will you not stand with your brothers in arms who are fighting the state through grassroots organization and peaceful democratic action? Is the fight for America truly over? No, friends, it is not time to secede. It's time to stand our ground and fight for this nation from the forces of corporatism, socialism, and tyranny. It's time to hold on to what we have and fight to make it more free for our posterity. As we are grateful to our ancestors, so will our descendants be if we give them a strong, unified nation built on the ideas of liberty and peace. It can only happen if we fight for it and work together across state lines and hold our ground. Even now, version of the founders' committees of correspondence exist on the internet. The first American patriots established committees to develop communication networks devoted to keeping patriots informed. At the time, their only method was to send letters. FreedomWorks had, at the time, established its own version through Freedom Connector. And what am I doing right here, right now with the Libertarian Republic? What am I doing with my presidential run, my campaigns? What am I doing right now, every day, but trying to build a coalition of libertarians across the entire United States that can fight for our liberties? That's a little bit of segue there. But also, why leap to secession? Of course, we've got another option, which is nullification. States should consider these laws, and there is a question of their constitutionality, but perhaps this is another option for us. Or perhaps we need to reinvigorate the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." This has clearly given authority to the states and the individuals to claim rights that are not written in the Bill of Rights. The founders knew that it would be impossible to fully codify all the privileges and immunities granted by citizenship, so they left us this powerful tool to fight back with. States like Arizona, Virginia, Utah, Idaho, they've even passed legislation that declared certain provisions of Obamacare null and void. And now look what's happened. Now we are, in 2012 when I wrote that, we couldn't have known that in just 4 short years we would have a president that is ostensibly going to get rid of Obamacare. Also, individual citizens must begin to use more aggressively their right of jury nullification. Jury nullification is when a jury acquits a defendant who is technically guilty of the law, but who does not deserve punishment. It occurs when a verdict opposed to the judge's instructions is handed down by citizen activists sitting on a jury. It has been used before and has experienced renewed energy in places like New Hampshire, where a jury recently acquitted a man for growing marijuana for medical uses. A single informed citizen on a jury can have a more powerful effect than the entire House of Legislators. Tools such as jury nullification, the 10th Amendment, and our committees of correspondence are our modern freedom ninjas, are our weapons to fight tyranny without needless bloodshed or the loss of our country as a whole. The time now is to fight and work together and use these tools. It is not time to leave. It is time to stand and fight. We must proceed boldly against evil. However, if things change for the worse and we are denied the right of redress of grievances, if we experience taxation without representation, if we are conscripted to fight in foreign wars against our individual liberties, I reserve the right to secede. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching the Freedom Report podcast. If you stayed for the whole thing, ladies, you are super nerds. Thank you very much for watching the show tonight. You guys can find out more about what I'm doing at the libertarianrepublic.com. You can find more also at the libertyviral.com. And libertyviral.com is hosted by Jennifer Georgie, our new editor-in-chief over at Liberty Viral, as well as a new editor-in-chief at the Libertarian Republic, and his name is Cody Fairfield. Check out his writings every single day. Your home for economic freedom and personal liberty. Also, if you like this cool hat, Make Taxation Theft Again, you can find that at threadsofliberty.com. That's threadsofliberty.com, the AP collection. Thank you very much for watching our show, and have a terrific night.